The glass shattered. Ice scattered across the marble floor like broken teeth. Paige stood frozen, the empty pitcher trembling in her white-knuckled grip, staring at the spreading, dark stain on Roman Gallo's bespoke wool suit. The entire high-end restaurant went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the HVAC. People didn't breathe around Roman Gallo, let alone ruin his clothes. She closed her eyes, waiting for the inevitable. Instead, a low, dry voice cut the silence. Get her a towel. The ache in Paige's lower back had bypassed a dull throb and settled into a sharp electrical burn right around hour 7 of her shift. The Onyx Room was the kind of restaurant where a single steak cost more than Paige's monthly water bill. The lighting was impossibly dim, the jazz was live but unobtrusive, and the clientele spoke in hushed, wealthy murmurs. Waitstaff were expected to be ghosts, invisible, silent, and perfect. Paige was none of those things tonight. She was exhausted. Her left heel had a blister the size of a quarter, and her right wrist was wrapped in a nude-colored compression bandage hidden under the cuff of her crisp white uniform. Pouring wine, carrying trays of searing hot ceramic plates, and smiling through the condescension of tech bros and hedge fund managers had worn the joint down to a fraying thread. Then Roman Gallo walked in. The atmosphere in the room physically changed. It wasn't a shift in the lighting or the music, but a sudden drop in barometric pressure. Forks stopped scraping against porcelain. Conversations clipped off mid-sentence. Paige was standing near the wait station, refilling a massive crystal water pitcher, when she saw him. Roman didn't swagger. He didn't have a cigar clamped between his teeth or wear flashy gold rings. He wore a charcoal grey suit that draped over his broad shoulders with architectural precision. His dark hair was neatly parted, threaded with premature silver at the temples. His face was a study in hard angles, dominated by dark, tired eyes that scanned the room with the detached efficiency of a predator assessing a sparse watering hole. He was flanked by 2 men who wore their suits like armor. "Table 4. Arthur, the floor manager, hissed, materializing beside Paige. He was already sweating. The vein in his neck pulsed wildly. "Gallo. He takes the corner booth. No eye contact, no small talk. Just pour the water, hand him the menu, and get out of the blast radius. Do you understand me, Paige?" "I've got it," she muttered, hoisting the heavy crystal pitcher. Her wrist gave a faint, warning twinge. She ignored it. Rent was due in 4 days, and Arthur was looking for any excuse to cut staff. She navigated the narrow spaces between the tables, her eyes fixed on the empty glass, resting near Roman's right hand. He was already seated. He didn't look at the menu. He was staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the rain-slicked city streets. Paige approached the table. She stepped to his right, aiming the spout of the heavy crystal pitcher toward his glass. "Just pour and leave." She tilted the pitcher. Inside her wrist, something popped. It felt like a rubber band snapping against her bone. The muscle simply gave out. Her hand went limp. The heavy crystal pitched forward. Time didn't slow down. That was a myth. It happened with brutal, terrifying speed. The pitcher slipped from her grip, slamming hard onto the edge of the mahogany table before tipping directly into Roman Gallo's lap. A gallon of ice water, garnished with sharp wedges of lemon, cascaded over the charcoal wool. The heavy crystal pitcher hit the floor and exploded. Ice cubes skittered across the polished marble, sounding like a handful of gravel thrown against a window. The silence that followed was absolute. The jazz trio stopped playing. The low murmur of the dining room died. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of ice water falling from the edge of the mahogany table onto the floor. Paige couldn't breathe. Her lungs felt like they had been filled with cement. She stared at the water soaking into the front of Roman's jacket, turning the expensive grey wool into a dark, muddy sludge. A single slice of lemon rested perfectly on his knee. One of his guards, a massive man with a flattened nose, stepped forward, his hand slipping inside his jacket. Roman didn't flinch. He didn't gasp from the cold. He slowly turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto Paige. Up close, his eyes weren't just dark. They were completely hollow. There was no rage in them, just an endless, freezing calm. Paige started, her voice sounding like dry leaves. My wrist. I am so sorry. Roman looked down at the lemon slice on his knee. He picked it up between his thumb and forefinger and placed it gently on the table. Get her a towel, Roman said. His voice was a low rumble, raspy and quiet. Before Paige could move, Arthur was there. The manager practically threw himself between Paige and the table, brandishing a stack of white linen napkins like a white flag of surrender. Mr. Gallo, Arthur babbled, his voice pitched high with panic. Mr. Gallo, I cannot express the depth of my apologies. This girl is new. She's clumsy. She's fired. Immediately. We will cover the dry cleaning. We will cover the cost of the suit. Your meal is on the house for the rest of the year. Roman raised a single hand. Just an inch. Arthur snapped his mouth shut so fast his teeth clicked. Roman slowly stood up. The water ran down his trousers, pooling in his expensive leather Oxfords. He didn't look ridiculous, which somehow made it worse. He looked like a man who had just waded through a river to get to his target. He took a linen napkin from Arthur's trembling hand and slowly patted the lapel of his jacket. Then he looked past the manager, his gaze finding Paige again. You're firing her, Roman stated. It wasn't a question. Yes. Absolutely. Arthur nodded frantically. She's done. Paige felt a hollow ache open up in her stomach. Fired. No rent money. No health insurance. She looked at the broken glass on the floor, the anger starting to override her fear. She was tired of being terrified. She was just so damn tired. Don't fire her, Roman said, tossing the damp napkin onto the table. Arthur blinked. Excuse me. I said don't fire her. Roman stepped around the puddle of water, stopping inches from Paige. He smelled of rain, sharp aftershave, and cold, damp wool. He was a full head taller than her. What's your name? Paige forced herself to look up, meeting his eyes. Paige. Well, Paige. Roman said, his tone entirely conversational. This suit was custom cut in Milan. The wool is Loro Piana. It cost $6,000. If he fires you, you have no income. If you have no income, you can't pay me back. Paige let out a short, bitter laugh. She couldn't help it. It just slipped out. Pay you back, I make $14 an hour plus tips. It would take me a year to pay for your jacket. The guard with the flat nose shifted, scowling at her tone. Roman just watched her, his expression unreadable. Then you better get to work, Roman said. He reached into his inside pocket, the one that wasn't soaked, and pulled out a heavy matte black card. He held it out between two long fingers. Paige hesitated, then took it. The card just had an address on it. No name, no phone number. Friday, 8 p.m., Roman said, turning away. Wear black. The break room smelled of stale coffee and industrial bleach. Paige sat on a plastic folding chair, staring at the matte black card in her hand. Arthur paced the length of the small room, wiping his forehead with a paper towel. You're going, Arthur said, pointing a shaking finger at her. I don't care if he wants you to clean his gutters with a toothbrush. You are going to that address. Do you understand who that man is? I know who he is, Arthur. Paige said, her voice flat. Roman Gallo. Extortion racketeering, probably a dozen bodies buried under the new stadium. I read the news. Then you know he doesn't leave loose ends. Arthur snapped, his voice cracking. He told me not to fire you. So you're not fired. But if you don't show up on Friday, he comes back here. And if he comes back here, he's not coming for the steak. Paige rubbed her forehead. Her wrist was throbbing mercilessly now. She unbuttoned her cuff and looked at the compression bandage. She needed a new one. She needed ibuprofen. She needed a different life. She wasn't stupid. She knew the stories about the Gallo family. They ran the port, they ran the unions, and they ran the underground gambling rings that catered to the city's elite. Roman was the youngest son, the one who took over after his father, and 2 older brothers were killed in a car bomb 5 years ago. He had stabilized the family business with terrifying quiet efficiency. He wasn't a man who made quirky little deals with waitresses. Unless Paige thought cynically he's just a creep. But the look in his eyes hadn't been predatory. It had been something else. It looked like accounting. A cold, hard ledger of debts and credits. She ruined $6,000 worth of property. Therefore, she owed him $6,000 worth of labor. Friday rolled around with the grim inevitability of a dental appointment. Paige wore her black work slacks, comfortable black shoes, and a plain black button-down shirt. She tied her dark hair back into a severe knot. She left her apartment in the gritty south end of the city and took 2 buses to reach the address on the card. It was a sprawling estate on the cliffs overlooking the ocean, separated from the highway by 10-foot-high iron gates and a thick perimeter of old-growth pine trees. She walked up to the heavy steel call box and pressed the button. "Name," a static-laced voice barked. "Paige," she said, wrapping her arms around herself against the coastal wind. "I'm supposed to be here." The gate clicked and swung inward on silent hinges. Paige walked up the winding driveway. The house was massive, but it wasn't the ornate statues and fountains monstrosity she expected from Mafia money. It was modern, brutalist architecture, concrete glass and dark wood. It looked like a fortress disguised as an architectural digest feature. Before she even reached the front steps, the heavy oak door opened. It was the guard from the restaurant, the one with the flat nose. "Arms up," he grunted. Paige didn't argue. She raised her arms. The man patted her down with professional, impersonal efficiency, checking her waistline and her ankles. "I'm Luca," he said, stepping back. "Don't talk to the guests. Don't look at the cards on the table. You pour the drinks, you clear the empty glasses, you serve the food. If you hear something, you shouldn't pretend you didn't. Understand, clear glasses. Don't listen." "Got it," Paige said dryly. Luca gave her a sideways look, a hint of a smirk touching his scarred mouth. "In here." He led her through a cavernous, sparsely furnished hallway and pushed open a set of double doors. The room was hazy with blue cigar smoke. A heavy oak table dominated the center, illuminated by a low-hanging chandelier. 5 men sat around the table. Stacks of chips, some colored black and gold, sat in messy piles in front of them. Roman was sitting at the head of the table. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing a network of faded ink and scars. He looked up when Paige entered. His expression didn't change, but he gave a slight nod. Paige walked over to a wet bar in the corner of the room. It was stocked with bottles that cost more than her car. Luca handed her a silver tray and a small, heavy crystal glass. "Macallan 25, Luca muttered. "Neat. Bring it to Donovan." He tipped his chin toward a heavy-set, red-faced man sweating profusely on the left side of the table. Paige poured the amber liquid, arranged it on the tray, and walked quietly to the table. She slipped into the space behind the heavy-set man and lowered the tray. "Your drink, sir." Donovan didn't look at her. He snatched the glass, knocking the edge against the silver tray. Some of the scotch sloshed over his fingers. "Watch it, sweetheart," Donovan snarled, not taking his eyes off his cards. "Apologies," Paige said in her best deadpan customer service voice. She stepped back, wiping the tray with a cloth. She stood in the corner for an hour. Her feet hurt, her wrist ached. She watched the game. It wasn't friendly. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Donovan was losing badly. The chips were steadily migrating across the green, felt to Roman's side of the table. Roman played with mechanical precision. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He just bet called and took the money. "I need another," Donovan barked, slamming his empty glass on the table. Paige walked over, picking up the empty glass. "Same again." Donovan finally turned around to look at her. His eyes were bloodshot, and he smelled like sour sweat and expensive cologne. "Are you deaf? I said I need another." He reached out his thick fingers, grabbing Paige's wrist. Her right wrist. The pressure hit the bruised, inflamed tendon perfectly. Paige let out a sharp gasp, her knees buckling slightly from the sudden blinding spike of pain. She yanked her arm back, but Donovan's grip was like a vice. "Hey!" Donovan slurred, pulling her closer. "I'm talking to you." "Let go of me," Paige said. She didn't scream, she didn't plead. Her voice was flat hard and laced with absolute exhaustion. She looked down at Donovan's hand, then up at his bloodshot eyes. "I just poured the scotch. Let go of my arm," Donovan scoffed, leaning in. "Feisty little waitresses out here. Where'd you find her Roman—" "Donovan." Roman's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It cut through the clinking of chips and the hum of the air purifier like a scalpel. Donovan paused, looking across the table. Roman hadn't moved, but his posture had shifted. The relaxed lean was gone. He was sitting perfectly straight, his dark eyes fixed entirely on Donovan's hand, wrapped around Paige's wrist. "Let her go," Roman said. "Just having a little fun, Roman. The service here is terrible." Donovan sneered, though his grip loosened a fraction. "She works for me," Roman said, his voice dropping another octave. "And she is currently paying off a debt. If you break her wrist, she can't work. If she can't work, she can't pay me. Are you offering to take on her debt, Donovan?" Donovan looked at the massive pile of chips in front of Roman, then down at Paige. He let go of her arm as if it had caught fire. "Just get the damn drink," Donovan muttered, turning back to his cards. Paige stepped back, rubbing her throbbing wrist. She looked at Roman. He didn't look back at her. He was already staring at his hand, organizing his chips. "Raise," Roman said quietly. The game broke up around 3 in the morning. Donovan left, completely broke his face, purple with rage, flanked by his own silent guards. The other men filtered out shortly after leaving Roman, sitting alone at the massive oak table, surrounded by empty glasses, overflowing ashtrays and towers of casino chips. Paige was moving methodically around the room, wiping down the wood polish, collecting the dirty crystal, and loading them onto a rolling cart. Her whole body felt like a lead weight. Luca stood by the double doors watching her work for a moment, before stepping out into the hall, leaving her alone with the boss of the Gallo family. Roman picked up a deck of cards and began shuffling them. The sound was crisp, rhythmic, and hypnotic. "Roop! Roop! Roop!" "Put ice on it," Roman said suddenly. Paige paused, holding a damp rag over an ashtray. "Excuse me." "Your wrist," Roman said, not looking up from the cards. He dealt out a perfect row of 5 cards face down. "You favored your left hand all night. When Donovan grabbed your right, you nearly went to the floor. When you spilled the water at the restaurant, it wasn't because you tripped. You dropped it." Paige bristled. She threw the dirty rag onto the cart. "I'm sorry my defective joints ruined your suit, Mr. Gallo. If it's a problem, you can break my legs and we can call it even." Roman stopped shuffling. He looked up, resting his elbows on the table. He studied her for a long, quiet moment. "You have a terrible attitude for someone in $6,000 of debt," he noted. "I have a terrible attitude because I've been awake for 22 hours. Paige shot back, too tired to filter her words. Survival instincts only lasted so long before sheer exhaustion overrode them. I worked a 9-hour shift at a restaurant that treats me like furniture. I rode a bus for an hour to get here, and I've spent the last 6 hours watching rich men burn enough money to buy my apartment building. So forgive me if I'm short on charm." Silence stretched between them. Paige bit her lip, suddenly realizing what she had just said. She had just snapped at a man who could make her disappear with a single phone call. She waited for the anger. She waited for him to stand up, for the cold menace to return to his eyes. Instead, Roman reached out and flipped over one of the cards. The Queen of Spades. "Luca," Roman called out. The door opened instantly. Luca stepped in. "Pay her for the night," Roman instructed, his eyes still on the cards. $300. Paige frowned. "I thought I was working off a debt." "You are," Roman replied. "Your debt was reduced by the value of your labor tonight. The $300 is for hazard pay. Donovan is a pig." He swept the cards together. "Come back next Friday. Tell Luca if you need a ride. The buses don't run past midnight." Paige stared at him. It was a completely transactional exchange, devoid of any warmth or hidden meaning. It was purely business. "Thank you," she managed to say. "Don't thank me," Roman said, finally standing up. The exhaustion on his face mirrored her own. He looked like a man carrying a house on his shoulders. "You owe me $5,700. You're going to be here a long time, Paige." As he walked past her toward the door, he stopped. He looked at the compression bandage peeking out from her sleeve. "And fix the wrist," he said quietly. "You're useless to me, Broken." He walked out, leaving Paige alone in the smoky room. She looked at the roll of crisp bills Luca handed her a moment later. It was more than she made in a week. She walked out into the cold coastal night, the adrenaline finally leaving her system, replaced by a strange, unsettling clarity. Roman Gallo was a monster. The city knew it. The police knew it. But as Paige stood waiting for her cab, clutching the hazard pay in her pocket, she realized something else. For the first time in years, someone had actually noticed she was in pain. The cortisone shot cost exactly $250. Paige watched the needle slide into the swollen joint of her right wrist in the sterile, fluorescent-lit room of a strip mall urgent care. The doctor, a man who looked like he hadn't slept since the late 90s, pushed the plunger down. A deep, agonizing pressure flared under her skin, followed immediately by a strange, numbing relief. She bought a proper, heavy-duty brace with the remaining $50 from her hazard pay. When Friday arrived, she didn't take the bus. At exactly 7:15, a black SUV idled by the curb outside her apartment complex. The neighborhood kids had already backed away from it, recognizing the expensive, heavy tint of a vehicle that didn't belong in their zip code. Luca was behind the wheel. He didn't say a word when she climbed in, just gave her right wrist a brief, calculating glance before putting the car in drive. The estate looked different in the rain. The brutalist concrete structure seemed to absorb the water, turning a dark, bruised gray against the stormy coastal sky. Inside, the atmosphere was tight. There was no poker game tonight. The heavy oak table had been cleared and polished to a mirror shine. Instead of cigar smoke and expensive scotch, the air smelled of roasting garlic rosemary and tension. Dinner service. Luca grunted, leading her to the massive industrial kitchen. A private chef was packing up his knives. He looked terrified. 4 guests. Serve from the left, clear from the right. Keep the wine glasses full. Don't speak unless spoken to. And Paige. She paused, tying a black apron around her waist. "Yeah. If someone drops a fork, let it lie." Paige frowned, but nodded. The men who arrived at 8 o'clock were older than Donovan. They wore suits that looked older too, heavy tweeds and dark wools. They moved with the slow, deliberate confidence of apex predators who had survived past their prime. Roman sat at the head of the table. He wore a black turtleneck and a dark suit jacket, the casual clothing somehow making him look more dangerous than the bespoke tailoring from the restaurant. He didn't smile when the men entered. He just nodded to the empty chairs. The dinner was an exercise in psychological warfare. Paige moved like a ghost. She poured the Barolo. She set down plates of seared branzino. She kept her eyes on the table, but she listened. She couldn't help it. The union contracts at the South Terminal are up for renewal. Roman, an older man named Carmine, said. He was methodically picking the bones out of his fish. Your father always favored a collaborative approach with our family on these matters. My father is dead, Carmine, Roman said. He hadn't touched his food. He was drinking sparkling water with a twist of lemon. And the South Terminal belongs to Gallo Shipping. There is no collaboration. The current contracts will be renewed as they are. Carmine stopped picking at his fish. He looked up, his pale eyes catching the light of the chandelier. Things can get unpredictable at the docks. Machinery breaks. Cargo goes missing. It would be a shame to see your profits dip because of a lack of oversight. It was a threat. Barely veiled, sitting right there on the polished wood between the crystal and the china. Paige stepped forward to refill Carmine's wine glass. Her hand was perfectly steady. The new brace gripped her wrist, rendering the joint painless and locked. Roman watched the dark red wine splash into the glass. If machinery breaks, I buy new machines. Roman said, his voice dropping into that raspy, hollow register Paige remembered from the restaurant. If cargo goes missing, I find out who took it, and then I break them. I don't need oversight, Carmine. I need you to finish your fish and leave my house. The silence in the room was absolute. The other three guests stopped breathing. Carmine stared at Roman for a long, heavy moment. Then very slowly, he wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. Arrogance is a young man's luxury, Roman. You'll find it gets expensive. I can afford it, Roman replied. The men left before dessert. Paige was wiping down the counter in the kitchen an hour later when the door swung open. Roman walked in. He took off his jacket, tossing it over the back of a bar stool. He looked exhausted. The tension that had held his spine rigid during dinner seemed to bleed out of him, leaving him looking hollowed out under the harsh kitchen lights. He walked to the commercial refrigerator, pulled out a bottle of cold water, and cracked it open. He drank half of it in one go, then leaned against the counter, staring at the floor. Paige kept wiping the stainless steel. You fixed the wrist, he said, not looking up. I bought an investment, Paige corrected. A cortisone shot and a brace. Cost me exactly what you paid me. So technically I'm working for free tonight. Roman finally looked at her. A faint, humorless smile touched the corner of his mouth. You're chipping away at $5,700. You're not working for free. You're buying your freedom back. Right. My mistake. She tossed the rag into the sink. Do you want me to clear the dining room? Luca will do it, Roman said. He set the water bottle down. Carmine is going to cause a strike at the docks by Tuesday. It's going to cost me 100 times what your mistake cost me. Paige leaned against the counter opposite him. She didn't know why he was telling her this. Maybe because she was entirely disconnected from his world. A neutral sounding board. Why didn't you just agree to collaborate? She asked. Because if you give men like Carmine an inch, they measure it for a coffin, Roman said flatly. You let them take a cut of the union dues next year, they want the freight lines. Then they want the warehouses. You hold the line, or you lose the territory. Paige thought about Arthur at the restaurant, constantly cutting her shifts by 15 minutes to save on payroll, slowly squeezing her out, because she never complained. I get it, Paige said quietly. Roman tilted his head, studying her. Do you? If you show people you bleed, they stop treating you like a person and start treating you like a food source, she said, looking down at her black orthopedic shoes. You have to be stone, or they eat you alive. Roman didn't reply right away. He just looked at her, his dark eyes analyzing the tired set of her shoulders, the cheap fabric of her uniform, the heavy brace on her wrist. Luca will drive you home, Roman said softly. 2 months passed. The routine solidified. Monday through Thursday, Paige was a ghost at the Onyx room. She poured water, carried plates, and ignored Arthur's frantic micromanagement. But something had fundamentally shifted. Arthur no longer yelled at her. In fact, he actively avoided making eye contact. It had happened after the 3rd week. Luca had picked her up from the restaurant's alleyway in the black SUV because her shift ran late. Arthur had stepped out for a smoke, seen the flat-nosed giant open the door for his quietest waitress, and promptly dropped his cigarette. In Arthur's mind, Paige was no longer a liability. She was Roman Gallo's property. Paige hated the implication, but she didn't correct him. For the first time in her life, she had job security. Every Friday and Saturday night she worked at the estate. She learned the rhythms of the house. She learned that Roman drank his coffee black cold and entirely out of utility. She learned that the house had a security system that could rival a military base. She learned that the men who came and went were not friends. They were assets, liabilities, or threats. Her ledger, a small black notebook Roman kept in his study, showed her debt dropping steadily. 4,000. 3,500. Then came the 2nd Friday in November. It was raining again. The coastal storms were getting violent. Paige was in the study cataloguing a delivery of expensive liquor when the front doors banged open. The noise was wrong. It wasn't the smooth, heavy thud of the oak shutting. It was a crash. Paige froze, a bottle of Japanese whiskey in her hands. Footsteps echoed in the cavernous hall. Heavy, dragging footsteps. She stepped out of the study and looked down the corridor. Roman was leaning heavily against Luca. Roman's crisp white shirt was ruined. A massive, spreading stain of dark red soaked the right side of his ribcage. He wasn't wearing his jacket. His breathing was shallow and wet. "Kitchen!" Luca barked, his face pale and tight. Paige didn't scream. She didn't drop the bottle. The sheer cynical pragmatism that kept her alive kicked in. She set the bottle on a console table and ran to the kitchen. By the time Luca hauled Roman through the swinging doors, Paige had cleared the large stainless steel prep island. "Get him up," Luca grunted. Together they hoisted Roman onto the cold metal. Roman groaned, a low animal sound that made the hair on Paige's arms stand up. His eyes were squeezed shut, his jaw locked. "What happened?" Paige asked, her voice clipped and steady. She was already moving to the sink, turning on the hot water, grabbing a stack of clean bar towels. "Drive-by outside the warehouse," Luca snarled, shrugging off his own jacket. He had a graze on his cheek that was bleeding freely. "Carmine's guys. Got him in the side." "Hospital?" Paige asked, tossing Luca a wet towel. "No hospitals," Roman rasped from the table. He opened his eyes. They were hazy with pain, but the iron will was still there. "No cops. Doc is on his way." Luca started ripping Roman's ruined shirt open. The wound was ugly, a jagged tear just below the ribs. It was bleeding sluggishly dark and thick. "Press here," Luca told Paige, taking her hands and forcing them down onto a wadded towel directly over the bullet hole. "Hard. Don't let up. I need to get the kit from the basement." "Go," Paige said. Luca sprinted out of the kitchen. Paige stood over Roman Gallo, leaning her entire body weight onto her hands. The blood soaked through the towel, instantly warm and sticky against her skin. Roman looked up at her. His chest heaved against her hands. He looked younger like this. Stripped of the suit, stripped of the power, he just looked like a man bleeding out on a kitchen counter. "You're ruining another white shirt," Paige said. Her voice shook just a fraction. Roman let out a breath that might have been a laugh. It turned into a wet cough. "Put it on my tab." "You're bleeding on my hands, Gallo," she said, pressing harder. "If I get an infection, you're paying my medical bills." "Selfish." He breathed, his eyes sliding shut. "Hey!" Paige snapped, tapping his face with her elbow since her hands were occupied. "Open your eyes. Look at me. Do not pass out. I don't know how to do CPR, and I am not paying off the rest of my debt to a ghost." Roman's eyes fluttered open. He focused on her face. The cynical mask she wore was slipping. She looked terrified, but she wasn't backing away. Her grip on his side was like a vice. "Why aren't you running?" he asked, his voice, barely a whisper, over the sound of the rain lashing against the windows. "Doors open. You could walk, and go back to wiping tables for $14 an hour while constantly looking over my shoulder." Paige gritted her teeth, her arms aching from the pressure. "No thanks. I like the devil I know. Stay awake, Roman." The kitchen door slammed open. Luca was back, hauling a massive black medical bag, followed closely by a man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, who looked like he had been dragged out of bed. "Move," the doctor ordered. Paige stepped back, her hands covered in blood. She stood against the wall, shaking violently, as the adrenaline began to crash, watching them work to save the most dangerous man in the city. Roman survived. The bullet had cracked a rib, but missed the major organs. The underground doctor stitched him up, pumped him full of broad-spectrum antibiotics and painkillers, and left with a thick envelope of cash. For 2 weeks, the house went into lockdown. The heavy iron gates were reinforced. Luca brought in 5 more men who stood like statues in the corners of the property, heavy artillery bulging under their coats. The poker games stopped. The dinners stopped. Paige's role changed. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She was a caretaker. It wasn't a promotion she wanted, but she didn't have a choice. Roman refused to hire outside nurses. He didn't trust them. He trusted the ledger. He trusted the girl who was working off a debt because her motivation was clean, simple, and entirely transactional. "You owe me $1,000 for the nursing duties," Paige said on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. She was sitting in an armchair in Roman's bedroom. It was a massive Spartan room, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the grey ocean. Roman was sitting up in bed, a laptop balanced on his knees, reviewing shipping manifests. He looked pale, but the hollow exhaustion was gone, replaced by a quiet, simmering rage that he kept tightly leashed. He didn't look away from the screen. "Nursing is standard labor. It falls under the original debt agreement. I changed your bandages," Paige deadpanned. "I saw things, hideous things. That's premium labor, and hazard pay considering Carmine is still out there trying to finish the job." Roman finally closed the laptop. He looked at her across the room. The dynamic between them had shifted permanently since the night on the kitchen island. The fear was gone, replaced by a strange, barbed, mutual respect. "Carmine won't be a problem much longer," Roman said. Paige stopped filing her nails. She looked up, recognizing the dead, absolute certainty in his tone. "What does that mean?" "It means you shouldn't ask questions you don't want the answers to." Roman shifted, wincing slightly as the stitches pulled. "Fetch me the bourbon." "Doctor said no alcohol with the antibiotics," she replied, not moving from the chair. Roman glared at her. It was the look that terrified hedge fund managers and made Arthur sweat through his suits. "I said fetch the bourbon." Paige stared back. She slowly placed her nail file on the side table, stood up, and walked over to the heavy crystal decanter on the dresser. She poured 2 fingers of the amber liquid into a glass. She walked over to the bed and held it out. Roman reached for it. Before his fingers could touch the glass, Paige tipped her wrist and poured the entire contents onto the expensive hardwood floor. The liquid splashed over Roman's bare feet. Silence fell over the room, heavy and suffocating. Roman stared at the puddle on the floor, then slowly looked up at her. His eyes were wide, a flash of genuine shock breaking through his usual stoicism. "Are you insane?" he asked, his voice a dangerous, quiet hiss. "I'm protecting my investment," Paige said, her voice perfectly level, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "If you drink that, you compromise your liver while it's processing the antibiotics. If you get sick, you die. If you die, my debt defaults to whoever takes over your empire, and I am not working for Donovan or Carmine, so no bourbon." She set the empty crystal glass on his nightstand with a firm clink. Roman stared at her. He looked at the floor, then back at her defiant, terrified face. For the first time since she had met him, Roman Gallo laughed. It was a rough, rusty sound, startling in the quiet room. He leaned his head back against the headboard, laughing until he winced and clutched his side. "You spilled water on me to get into this mess," Roman wheezed, wiping a hand across his face. "And now you're spilling my $2,000 Pappy Van Winkle on my floors. You are an absolute menace, Paige." "I'm an employee, managing my boss's poor life choices," she retorted, grabbing a towel from the bathroom to clean up the mess. As she knelt on the floor, wiping up the spilled bourbon, the heavy atmosphere in the house shattered. An explosion rocked the estate. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a concussive blast that rattled the foundation. The floor-to-ceiling windows bowed inward, vibrating with a terrifying low-frequency hum. Paige fell sideways, dropping the towel. The security alarms triggered instantly, a deafening siren echoing through the hallways. Shouts erupted from the perimeter guards outside. Roman was out of bed in a second, ignoring the pain in his ribs. He grabbed a heavy black Glock from the drawer of his nightstand and racked the slide. "Get up!" Roman ordered, his voice cutting through the siren. The humor was entirely gone. The monster was back. Paige scrambled to her feet. "What was that?" "Front gate," Roman said, moving toward the door, keeping his body between her and the windows. Carmine decided not to wait. They breached the perimeter. Gunfire erupted outside. Fast rhythmic bursts of automatic fire answered by the heavier booming return fire of Luca and the guards. "Stay behind me," Roman said, opening the bedroom door. "Where are we going?" Paige asked, her cynicism evaporating into pure panic. "Shouldn't we lock the door?" "This room has 3 walls of glass," Roman said, dragging her into the hallway. "We need to get to the basement vault. Move!" They sprinted down the long, shadowed corridor. The house was chaotic. Gunfire echoed from the front foyer. Someone was shouting in Italian. They reached the top of the grand staircase just as the heavy oak front doors splintered inward. 3 men in dark tactical gear spilled into the foyer. Luca was at the bottom of the stairs, pinned behind a marble pillar, returning fire. One of the intruders saw Roman on the landing. He raised his weapon. Roman didn't hesitate. He pushed Paige hard to the left out of the line of fire and brought his weapon up. He fired twice. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. The intruder dropped. "Go!" Roman yelled, hauling Paige toward a concealed door paneled into the hallway wall. He threw the door open, revealing a set of concrete stairs plunging into darkness. He shoved her inside, stepping in right behind her, and slamming the heavy reinforced steel door shut. The sound of the gunfire was instantly muffled. They stood in the pitch-black stairwell, breathing hard. The only sound was the metallic click of Roman locking the deadbolts. Paige slid down the cold concrete wall until she hit a step, wrapping her arms around her knees. Her whole body was trembling. Roman sank down onto the step beside her. He let out a long, ragged exhale, resting his head against the wall. The silence between them was thick with adrenaline and the smell of cordite. "I'm docking this from my debt," Paige whispered into the darkness, her voice shaking violently. Roman didn't laugh this time. He just reached out in the dark, his hand finding her shoulder. He didn't say anything, but his grip was firm, grounding, and terrifyingly real. "Your debt is cleared, Paige," Roman said quietly into the blackness. "As of right now, you're done." The words hung in the suffocating darkness of the stairwell, heavier than the reinforced steel door that separated them from the gunfire. "Your debt is cleared. You're done." Paige couldn't see Roman's face. The blackness was absolute, pressing against her eyes until they ached. She could only hear him. His breathing was wet and ragged, echoing off the narrow concrete walls. "Don't do that," Paige said. Her voice cracked, betraying the sheer terror threading through her veins. "Do what?" Roman rasped. He sounded incredibly tired. "Don't absolve me just because you think we're going to die down here. It's cheap, Roman. It's a cliché." A short, brutal cough tore from his throat. The sound ended in a sharp hiss of pain. "We aren't going to die, but my stitches tore when I shot the guy on the landing. I'm bleeding out on your shoes. Move down the stairs, slowly." Paige felt along the rough, freezing concrete of the wall until her fingers found a cold metal handrail. She descended, counting the steps. 12. A small landing. Then another 12. Behind her, Roman's footsteps were heavy dragging. He was leaning his weight against the wall. At the bottom, Paige's hands met a flat, solid surface. Another door. Roman bumped into her back. His body was dangerously warm. "There's a keypad," he breathed near her ear. "Right side. Punch in 0419. Paige found the rubber keys. She typed the numbers. Heavy mechanical bolts retracted with a loud industrial thud. Roman leaned his weight against the center of the door, pushing it inward. Fluorescent lights snapped on instantly, blinding in their bright clinical intensity. Paige threw a hand over her eyes, stumbling into the room. It wasn't a dungeon. It was a bunker built for a siege. The walls were thick, poured concrete. A bank of security monitors sat dead and dark on a metal desk. Against the far wall were 2 cots, a pallet of bottled water, and a heavy locked medical cabinet. Roman didn't make it to the cots. He collapsed into a rolling office chair by the desk, his head falling back against the headrest. His shirt was soaked black. Fresh blood dripped from the hem, splattering onto the grey concrete floor. Paige didn't hesitate. The panic that had paralyzed her in the hallway evaporated, replaced by a cold surgical focus. She had spent a lifetime navigating crises, eviction notices, broken-down cars, empty bank accounts. This was just a different kind of crisis. She walked to the medical cabinet. It was locked with a simple padlock. She looked around, grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall, and smashed the heavy brass bottom against the lock. Once, twice. The metal bracket sheared off. She ripped the doors open. Bandages, antiseptics, sterile staple guns. She grabbed an armful and dumped it onto the desk next to Roman. "Take the shirt off," Paige ordered. Roman cracked one eye open. His skin was the color of dirty chalk. "I thought my debt to you was cleared." "It is. This is pro bono. Take the damn shirt off." He managed to unbutton it halfway before his hands failed him. Paige battered his fingers away. She stripped the ruined fabric off his shoulders, exposing the damage. The violent twist he'd made to fire his weapon had ripped the doctor's meticulous work completely open. The gash was ugly, weeping blood down his ribs. "This is going to hurt," she said, tearing open a package of sterile gauze. "Everything hurts, Paige," he muttered, closing his eyes. She pressed the gauze directly into the open wound. Roman's entire body went rigid. His jaw locked the tendons in his neck, standing out like steel cables, but he didn't make a sound. Paige leaned her weight into her hands, pressing down just like she had on the kitchen island. This time there was no Luca to take over. No underground doctor on the way. Just the two of them, buried beneath a war zone. They stayed like that for 20 minutes. The silence in the bunker was deafening. Above them, through feet of concrete and dirt, they couldn't hear the gunfire anymore. They couldn't hear the sirens. "Why didn't you run?" Roman asked quietly. His breathing was starting to even out as the pressure stemmed the bleeding. Paige kept her eyes on her blood-stained hands. "I told you. I need the money." "You don't owe me the money anymore. I wiped the ledger. You wiped it 5 minutes ago. Before that, I was an indentured servant." "Bullshit," Roman said. It wasn't loud, but it was absolute. "You could have walked out the kitchen door the night I got shot. You could have walked out the front door tonight. You stay because you're running from something worse." Paige finally looked at his face. "I'm not running from anything. You're running from being invisible," he said, his dark eyes stripping her bare. "You work in a place where people treat you like a fixture. You live in a neighborhood where nobody knows your name. You come here and you matter. You hold the leash of the monster. It makes you feel alive." Paige's jaw tightened. She pressed harder on his ribs, earning a sharp hiss. "You think highly of yourself, Gallo." "I think highly of you," Roman corrected. "That's the problem." Before Paige could process the weight of that statement, the radio on the desk crackled to life in a burst of violent static. "Boss!" It was Luca. His voice was breathless, heavy with exhaustion. "Clear." Roman didn't move. He just stared at Paige. "Casualties, 3 of ours, 6 of theirs. Carmine was leading the breach himself. Arrogant old fool." Luca paused, spitting something out. "Carmine is in a bag. House is secure. Cops are on the payroll. They're taking their time. It's safe to come up." "Understood," Roman said. He reached over, wrapping his large, bloody hand over Paige's wrists. "Let go. It's clotted." She slowly lifted her hands. The bleeding had slowed to a sluggish seep. Roman stood up. He swayed for a fraction of a second, then his spine locked into place. The vulnerability he had shown in the chair vanished, packed away behind a wall of cold, unyielding authority. "Clean your hands," Roman told her, pointing to a small utility sink in the corner. "Then we go upstairs, and then you go home." The morning sun was brutally unforgiving. It poured through the shattered floor-to-ceiling windows of the estate, illuminating the destruction. The hardwood floors were scored with bullet holes. Blood stained the Persian rugs. The heavy front doors were reduced to splinters. Paige stood in the foyer, wearing a clean, oversized black hoodie Luca had found for her. Her own clothes were ruined. Roman stood by the remains of the front door. He had a fresh bandage wrapped tightly around his ribs, hidden beneath a clean black button-down shirt. He looked entirely in his element amidst the ruin. A king surveying a scarred battlefield. He held out a thick, heavy manila envelope. Paige looked at it, then up at his face. His expression was a stone wall. "What is that?" she asked. Her voice felt hollow in the massive, drafty space. "Severance," Roman said. $50,000 in untraceable cash. There's also a clean passport in there. A new social security number. You can go to California. You can go to Europe. You can buy a house where nobody knows your name." "I told you don't owe me." "Take it," Roman interrupted his voice, dropping into a dangerous rumble. He stepped closer, forcing the envelope against her chest. "Carmine is dead, but he has nephews. He has lieutenants. The Gallo family just went to war. If they find out you bandaged me up, they will use you to get to me. You are a liability." The word hit her like a physical blow. Liability. She wasn't a partner. She wasn't an employee. She was a weakness he was paying to remove. Paige snatched the envelope. It was heavy. It felt like dirty money, even if it was meant to be a lifeline. "Right," Paige said, stepping back. The cynical armor snapped back into place. "Good doing business with you, Roman." She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked down the long, winding driveway. She didn't look back. If she looked back, she knew she would fracture, and she refused to give him the satisfaction. The bus ride to the south end of the city took 2 hours. The $50,000 burned a hole in her backpack. Her apartment was exactly as she left it. The peeling wallpaper in the hallway. The smell of boiled cabbage from Mrs. Higgins next door. The constant, distant wail of police sirens. Paige dropped the envelope on her cheap laminate kitchen table. She sat in the silence for a long time. She could leave. She could pack a single bag, take a train out of state, and never pour another glass of water for an arrogant tech bro again. She had freedom. Absolute, terrifying freedom. At 4 p.m., she stood up, put on her crisp white uniform shirt, wrapped her wrist in the nude compression bandage, and went to work. The Onyx room was humming with the Friday night dinner rush. The jazz trio was playing a smooth, soulless rendition of a Coltrane classic. The lighting was perfectly dim. Arthur spotted her walking through the service doors. He practically tripped over a bus boy to get to her. "Paige!" Arthur breathed, his eyes wide. He looked at her like she was carrying a live grenade. You're here. We heard about the disturbances at the coast last night." The news had hit the underground wire. Of course it had. "I'm here for my shift, Arthur," she said, tying her black apron around her waist. "Right, yes, of course. Table 4 is empty. Nobody is sitting there tonight. Out of respect." Paige looked out into the dining room. The corner booth was empty. The mahogany table gleamed under the recessed lighting. She grabbed a heavy crystal water pitcher from the wait station. She walked the floor. She poured water for a hedge fund manager who complained about the temperature of his steak. She refilled the wine glass of a woman draped in diamonds who didn't even acknowledge her presence. Paige stood in the corner of the room, holding the heavy pitcher. "You're running from being invisible." Roman's words echoed in her skull, louder than the jazz, louder than the clinking of silver against porcelain. She looked at the people in the room. They were safe. They were insulated by their wealth, completely oblivious to the blood and the violence that paved the city they played in. They complained about cold soup, while men bled out on concrete floors holding the line. Paige realized with a sickening, plunging sense of clarity that she hated them. She didn't want their life. She didn't want the safety. Safety was just another word for waiting to die quietly. She walked over to the wait station. She set the heavy crystal pitcher down on the counter. She untied the strings of her black apron and folded it neatly. Arthur appeared beside her. "Paige, what are you doing?" "Table 7 needs bread." "I quit, Arthur," Paige said. She didn't shout it. She just stated a fact. Arthur gaped at her. You can't quit. Does Mr. Gallo know you're quitting?" "Mr. Gallo doesn't own me," Paige said, turning to face her manager. She looked him dead in the eye. "And neither do you. Have a good life, Arthur." She walked out the front doors of the Onyx room, stepping into the cold, rain-slicked city streets. She didn't have a plan. She just knew she couldn't pretend to be a ghost anymore. The iron gates of the Gallo estate were twisted and scorched, hanging loosely off their massive stone hinges. A temporary chain-link fence had been erected in the gap, manned by 4 men carrying rifles openly in the heavy coastal fog. Paige paid the cab driver with a $100 bill and didn't wait for the change. She walked up to the fence. One of the guards, a man she didn't recognize, stepped forward, raising his hand. Property is closed. Turn around. Call Luca, Paige said, burying her hands in the pockets of her jacket. She was freezing, but her voice didn't shake. The guard frowned, reaching for the radio on his shoulder. Before he could unclip it, a massive shadow detached itself from the guardhouse. Luca stepped into the pale light. His face was bruised purple on one side, and his left arm was in a sling. He stared at Paige through the chain-link fence. "Open it!" Luca grunted to the guard. The guard hesitated, then dragged the heavy gate open, just enough for her to slip through. "He's in a foul mood," Luca warned as she walked past him. "Tore the kitchen apart an hour ago because the coffee was burnt. He's sleeping in the study. Won't go upstairs." "Good to know," Paige said. She walked up the winding driveway. The front doors had been replaced by heavy reinforced steel slabs. The house smelled strongly of bleach, sawdust, and old blood. The physical scars of the raid were being painted over, but the atmosphere was suffocating. She walked straight to the study. The door was partially open. Roman was sitting behind his massive oak desk. The room was dark, lit only by a single green glass banker's lamp. The desk was covered in shipping manifests, ledgers, and photographs of men Paige didn't want to know. Roman had a glass of amber liquid in his left hand. He looked terrible. The hollow exhaustion was back cutting deep grooves around his mouth. Paige stepped into the room. Roman didn't look up from his paperwork. "I told the contractors no noise past 5. Get out." "I brought your severance package back," Paige said. Roman froze. The glass in his hand stopped halfway to his mouth. He slowly lowered it to the desk, his dark eyes finally rising to meet hers. For a long second, he just stared at her. The silence in the study was a heavy, physical pressure. Then the mask slammed down. The cold, ruthless mob boss took the driver's seat. "I gave you an out," Roman said, his voice dropping into a lethal quiet register. "I gave you enough money to disappear. What the hell are you doing in my house?" Paige walked up to the desk. She unzipped her backpack, pulled out the heavy manila envelope, and dropped it onto the ledgers. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. "I don't want the buyout," Paige said. Roman stood up. He leaned his palms on the desk, ignoring the grimace of pain that flashed across his face as his ribs pulled. "Are you stupid? Do you have a death wish Carmine's family is regrouping? The feds are circling. This isn't a game, Paige. It's a war." "I know what it is," she shot back, stepping closer to the desk until she was toe-to-toe with him, separated only by the oak. "I bandaged the bullet holes. Remember?" "Then you should have run." "I tried. It didn't stick." Paige slammed her hands down on the desk, mirroring his posture. She was done being quiet. She was done being intimidated. "I went back to the restaurant. I poured water for cowards in expensive suits. And I realized I'd rather take my chances in a bunker with you than die of boredom playing it safe." Roman stared at her, the anger warring with something else. Something darker, deeper, and infinitely more dangerous. "You don't belong here," he said, but his voice lacked the absolute conviction it usually held. "I belong exactly where I choose to be," Paige countered. "But we're doing this on my terms." Roman let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "Your terms? You walk into the lion's den and demand to rewrite the rules." "Yes." She pointed a finger at his chest. "There is no debt. I don't owe you a dime. I am not your waitress. I am not your nurse. I am not a liability you can pay off to ease your conscience." "Then what are you?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "I'm the only person in this city who isn't afraid of you," Paige said softly. "I'm the only one who sees you." Roman went perfectly still. The air between them crackled thick and heavy. He looked at her defiant, stubborn face. He saw the cheap jacket, the dark circles under her eyes, and the absolute, unbreakable steel in her spine. She had spilled water on him, ruined his suit, talked back to him, bled with him, and now she had walked away from $50,000 just to stand in his ruined house and demand his respect. The invisible tether that had tied them together since the night at the Onyx Room finally snapped taut. Roman reached across the desk. His large hands gripped the lapels of her jacket. He didn't pull her gently. He hauled her over the scattered ledgers and photographs. Paige gasped as her knees hit the edge of the heavy oak desk, but she didn't pull back. She grabbed the fabric of his dark shirt, anchoring herself to him. His mouth crashed down on hers. It wasn't a sweet, romantic kiss. It was a collision. It tasted like expensive bourbon adrenaline and desperate, violent relief. Roman kissed her like he was trying to brand her a possessive, punishing claim that she met with equal ferocity. She tangled her hands in his dark hair, pulling him closer, anchoring the monster to the earth. He broke the kiss just enough to breathe, his forehead resting against hers. His breathing was ragged. "You stay." Roman rasped his voice, raw, his hands gripping her waist like a vice. "You stay, you're mine. You don't get to walk away when the bullets start flying again. There are no more outs." Paige looked into his dark, hollow eyes, finally seeing the fire burning behind them. "I'm not going anywhere, Gallo," she whispered. She pulled him back down, sealing the contract. It was a terrible deal. It was dangerous, cynical, and likely to get them both killed. But as Roman's arms locked around her, pulling her completely into his dark, violent world, Paige finally felt entirely terrifyingly safe. And just like that, Paige didn't just pay off her debt. She rewrote the entire ledger from a spilled glass of water to reigning by the side of the city's most feared mafia boss. She proved that sometimes the only way to beat a monster is to look him dead in the eye and refuse to blink. What did you think of Paige's ultimate choice? Would you have taken the 50 grand and run, or stayed for Roman? Drop your answers in the comments below. If you loved this dark, gritty romance, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your fellow Mafia Romance fans. See you in the next story.